Okay, welcome back to the Paraeducator Training course. This is Module 7 or Week 7, Day 2. We're talking about special education today. The law, inclusion, etc. Good topics. Short lecture today. Okay, including students who receive SPED services in general education classrooms is something that there are a lot of misunderstandings about. So your average person, your average parent, usually did not study early childhood education, right? We usually, not everybody studies that. So they may have various misconceptions about what it means to have an integrated classroom. One of the most important things is that there is no evidence that the inclusion of students with exceptionalities changes the academic achievement of other students in the classroom. So if you speak with parents about that, and I mean socially, like not as a representative of the school, but if you speak with someone, one of your friends, another parent about this, and they have concerns, you can refer to the idea that when we talk about evidence, so this statement is that there is no evidence that blah blah blah. When we speak of evidence in the research community, we don't just mean that there has been a cursory investigation and no evidence has been found. What is meant is that there is no statistically significant difference between non-integrated classes and integrated classes. So, friends ask you about this topic and you want to let them know what you have learned about it, you could refer to this. Okay. So evidence in the last slide, number 1, researchers. In the next slide, number 2, researchers have found benefits to having students with exceptionalities included in the general education classroom. Okay. So when we say that benefits have been found, evidence has been found, that means that there is a statistically significant improvement in terms of the learning of students who are in integrated classrooms, SPED and general education. And in order to make a claim like this is Dr. Sullivan's claim. In order to make a claim like this, there has to be a large body of evidence. In other words, it's not just one paper published here or a paper published there in Germany in 1973, right? There's a large body of work demonstrating that this is the case. Okay. And similarly, there's a large body of work demonstrating that this is not the case. Okay. So I'm going to hang on that just for one more moment. We can question things. Of course, we all question things all the time. Why is gas so expensive? Why are hamburgers bad for me? Right? All kinds of things. Why we question all kinds of things all the time. You can also question claims that people make. Here's one that I hear on news programs a lot. Studies have shown, right? Studies have shown that hamburgers are actually good for you. Oh, really? That's interesting news. We want to be able to follow up on that, investigate whose studies have shown that hamburgers are good for me. How many studies have shown that hamburgers are good for me? Okay, so conversationally, it's not enough to make a claim that studies have shown that when there are general education and special education students in the same room, there are problems, right? It's just not enough to make that claim. Okay, I'm just using that as an example. It could be anything, right? Like the hamburger example. Okay, let's think about this. Let's think about this claim. What do you think some of the benefits would be of having students with exceptionalities in the general education classroom? We brought this up in the previous module, and people talked a lot about, I got a lot of chats and messages about people's different experiences, real lived experiences with these things, as well as with these issues, as well as people's sort of expectations and trepidations, uncertainties about this kind of thing. So I think what we come up with at the end of the day is that integration of every kind is always beneficial, because as a species, you know, we are very diverse. So to not be exposed to other members of our species who are not exactly like us is limiting in some way. Okay, and these comments that I'm making right now are not responses to any particular person's comments. I'm telling you the same thing I would tell any person taking this class. All right. All right, so on day one of the current module, we talked about FAPE, which we referred to previously. We brought up LRE again. I think by now we're getting very familiar with LRE. Brought up IDEA, or IDEIA, as it's also known, and referred to people first language, talking about folks with exceptionalities instead of, you know, disabled people, things like that. We spoke a little bit about non-discriminatory evaluation and assessment. You know, folks, one size does not fit all in education. It never does. Or, you know, in life, really, one size does not fit all. You know, here's my here's my drink today, my bubbly water. Okay, to me, it's a regular size drink. What is it, 12 ounces or something? 16.9 ounces. Okay. In Japan, this drink is way too big. All right. In another place, I don't know, South Carolina, maybe it's way too small. I don't know. But one size does not fit all. And so we can extend that to talk about standardized tests. So if you have a test like the SAT, the GRE, the GMAT, the ESSA test, right? They are not set up to account for differences among learners, which we know are real differences. So we need to be able to evaluate and assess our students, especially when we're thinking about placement in special ed programs. We need to think about doing that evaluation, that assessment, in ways that are not discriminatory. All right. We spoke briefly about supplemental services. Probably talk about that again in tomorrow's module, if not today. And the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, we learned that this comes from IDEA, that IDEA mandates that IEPs be created. I'd like to boost up again the idea that early intervention, as far as really anything in education goes, is key. You know, the clear example is with behavior. When there are behavior problems, we want to be able to intervene as early as possible. When we learned about de-escalation techniques, the previous day's course, we were learning that once an escalation cycle begins, we need to be able to calm ourselves down right away and not mirror the behavior of the student who is escalating. So that's one area where early intervention is key. But also when an agency, like a school of some kind, notes that a particular student may be needing certain services that they're not currently getting, the earlier they intervene, the better, it appears. All right. And flowing from people first language, we have the deficit model versus the asset model. All right, so in other words, representing with language folks with exceptionalities, right? With, it's an asset. Folks without the ability to blah, 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 would be a representation of the deficit model. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this. There are ways to represent folks that don't present them as lacking something, as you would in a deficit model. Okay. If we have time, we have time. Let's talk about this. What do you think some of the benefits would be of having students with exceptionalities in the general education classroom? I'd like all of us to think about the deficit model versus the asset model. So at home with our young students, our children, because we're not professionals, all of us are not professionals in special education, we may refer to people with exceptionalities as people without something, because you know what? Most people just do. Most people simply do that. We've been trained to by our parents, right? So in terms of representing, being able to represent, having our children and other children represent folks with exceptionalities as having assets, having something that's with them rather than having lacunae, what's the right word? Having a lack of something is what we want to concentrate on today. All right, so let's talk about this. What do you think some of the benefits would be of having students with exceptionalities in the general education classroom? And we'll have a discussion on Canvas about this. For right now, let's connect with our group members. Recording in progress. All right. So some possible benefits of as much integration as possible between general ed and special ed is that fewer students are singled out, which can lead to more equality. Also, the general ed students can learn from the special ed students how to interact with them, which increases understanding all around. And, the special ed students probably learn not to fear the unknown, the unknown general ed students when there's more integration. This can also foster a sense of belonging. Students feel a sense of togetherness, and students look past differences, like in our cartoon over here. All right, and special education service receiving students get more attention from the teacher and from peers in the general ed classroom, especially when we have you, the paraeducators, around. All right. Let's move along to continuing our discussion of the learning environment. Inclusion, least restrictive environment, LRE. Okay. For the purposes of this discussion, inclusion has to do with educating students with exceptionalities in the general education classroom. And we remember that LRE is the least restrictive environment. Students with exceptionalities are educated in settings as close to general education as possible and receive appropriate education, that allows them to make satisfactory progress. Okay, we don't know who determines what is appropriate, but we know who determines what is satisfactory in terms of progress. And that is the team that develops the IEP. Okay, so the goals of the IEP are matched up with the goals of the school, and that's how we determine what what progress each student needs to make. All right, in the beginning, these many years ago, when inclusion was first promoted, many schools were not prepared. Remember, this is only kind of starting from the 70s, 1970s, and getting better up till today. So in the recent past, inclusion just meant that the student with an exceptionality was sitting in the general ed classroom, but not actually being included. They were just sort of there. Sometimes that would mean placing the student, physically placing them at a separate table in the back of the classroom with an aide, who may or may not be as trained as you all are becoming. I can tell you that in my days teaching high school, I'm going to talk about that again, I always had folks with 504s and with IEPs in my classes, and they usually sat in the front or in the middle, just wherever the other kids were sitting, and their paraeducators would be sitting by them when they had them. So it's not just teaching assistants or paraeducators, associate instructors that have not been sufficiently trained. It's also teachers haven't always been trained to know how to support students with exceptionalities. Unless you specialize in this in your credential program, when you're becoming a teacher, you're not necessarily going to know the techniques and everything. Going back to my high school teaching, I received absolutely zero training. No one even told me what a 504 was. Nobody told me what an IEP was. I just knew that some students had assistants that worked with them, which I was used to seeing from my high school days. So I can say with certainty that a lot of times teachers are not trained and there is not institutional support, but it's getting much better these days. It's gradually changing. Successful inclusion requires that teachers have appropriate training and support. More is expected of classroom teachers and paras than ever before. You know, it just keeps increasing. They never decrease their expectations on educators. All right, I hope you have enjoyed this journey through inclusion, and we will see each other again. At least you'll see me